and I can recall the sense of frustration for not understanding. And if you have experienced this sense of frustration for not understanding, you remember that it makes you feel frustrated, it makes you feel disempowered, it makes you feel unable to make decisions for yourself, for the people you love, for the people you lead, for your own communities. So that's why after my degree in engineering, I decided that I would study design, and I did an MA in industrial design first, and I worked as an industrial designer in Milan in a fantastic studio run by a Japanese industrial designer. And we used to design large machineries for factories. So the importance of the workers and the people interacting with the machineries was extremely high. But that's where I've learned the importance of beauty and the importance of sense of wonder. So my passion for designing, understanding grew more and more, and I decided to move to London. I did an MA in information design, so I specialized in information design. And the journey has been rather like intense and bumpy. But very soon I realized that information can be powerful only if it can be understood. And I've always been a very strong advocate of the fact that information design can play a unique role in that direction in order to democratize knowledge or explain complexity and facilitate understanding. Now, there are like tons of definitions of what information design is. Many people, I used to love the definition by Richard Sullivan, which is the founder of TED, and he says that information design is the design of the understanding. It's a very broad definition. I usually, when I teach and give courses, I used to rely on this one by Nathan Shedroff. He says that information design addresses the organization and presentation of data, its transformation into valuable, meaningful information. Now, this transformation from data to knowledge is a very complex process that is discussed by theorists, researchers, designers. And the diagram representing this process is known as the DIKW diagram, Data, Information, Knowledge, Wisdom diagram. And thanks to the practice as an information designer, I always had the opportunity of discussing this transition with other designers and students and activists and journalists and scientists. And in the span of 10 years, together with Tom, we have always changed and restyled the diagram. So I'm going to show you a version that is very similar to the one that Tom showed, a little bit more detailed. So the major focus of the process is our audience. And when and of course their context. And when I use the word audience, I don't mean simply lay people. I also refer to experts and governments and policymakers. So anybody that needs to understand the information we communicate because they need to make decisions or because they need to act in order to implement an intervention with that information. On the other extreme, we have the data, and data is the product of research, creation, and gathering and discovering. Data is the raw material. It's not a real communication, right? It's what we use to build our communications. So data, we usually say that data doesn't have an informational value. Okay, you don't exchange data if you are willing to reach your audience, if you want to communicate effectively. So when data is structured and organized in a specific way, it turns into information. Now, Tom mentioned this constant loop that you have between your audience and the data and exploring different ways of organizing the data. So this is actually a very iterative process that you go through. So you usually have a challenge or a need, so you have to explore the audience and the context, you have your data, you start organizing the data in a way that allows you to highlight specific patterns or specific messages, and then sometimes you can prototype quickly, you can test, you can check if it works, how people respond, and then you can go back to the data. Sometimes you need more data or you need less data, and so it's an iterative process. So what happens is that your goal is to just like create knowledge. So the goal is to facilitate through presentation the transition from information to knowledge. The point is that knowledge happens in the head of the people. And that's what makes this point a very critical point. Nathan Shedroff talks about wisdom, and wisdom is the ultimate level of understanding. It's where it follows like reflections and introspection, and it is when you become able to transfer the knowledge, to teach other people what you have learned. And then I've added to this diagram, I've added a step that is change. So knowledge and wisdom can guide our decisions, leading to change. And if you aim at change and action, you experience how hard this stage is. If you want to move people to change and action, you experience how hard this stage is. Now, the process that on the diagram looks extremely nice and neat, in reality looks more like this. It's extremely messy and confusing and iterative. And it is messy for a series of reasons. Because of the collaborative nature of the design process, so you have a series of stakeholders throughout the process, and you have to be able to bridge between them. Because cognition is very complex. Information is mediated by the human brain. It's not the message that goes into the brain, but the interpretation of that message and how it is encoded. Because science tells us that as human beings, we assess how the information we receive is going to affect our lives and the social link to the people or to the groups that we belong to. So when information threatens those values, we tend to refuse the information, even if there is scientific evidence behind it. So this is the specific case of, I don't know, climate change, for example, or vaccines. And finally, because even if the information is communicated clearly, even if you have convinced, or if you have enabled your audience to understand, it might be that these people are not able to actually turn that understanding into action, because there are barriers out there that prevent you from doing so. So it's quite complex. One of the things that I always say is that in order to facilitate the transition from data to action, one of the tools that you can rely on is an approach. So it's a participatory approach. And many of us might be familiar here with the concept of human-centered approach. So it is important to embrace the audience in the design process and to embrace the stakeholders in the design process. It is important to dive into their context, to understand the barrier and the facilitators in order to understand how to avoid blocking points, okay? According to what you want to achieve. Do you want to achieve raise in awareness? Do you want to achieve understanding? Do you want to achieve action? So I would argue that facilitating a participatory approach is a good start if your ultimate goal is knowledge. So there are two things that are important. So if I had to sum up. One is how people receive our message through their values. So there are two filters. One is the value system of people. This value system is extremely strong. So understanding goes through this filter. Okay? It doesn't matter sometimes how reliable and evidence-based is what we are telling people. If the value system is clashing with what we are communicating and with the way the message is constructed, there is no way we can reach people. And there is a second filter, which is the senses. Our senses are another filter. So that's why when we talk about design, we have to talk about the importance of crafting the message in the respect of the value system of the people we are communicating to. But it's very important also to rely on all those cognition and perception and use of typography and the space and the use of color and size. Someone was asking about color last week. Color is one of the most extraordinary pre-attentive attributes that we have. And you can actually guide people's understanding by using pre-attentive attributes like size and color. So for example, in the courses that we run, we try to explain people how you can use the structure and the white space and the empty space and the grid on a page, because values are important, but also senses are important. So perception and cognition are extremely important. So in the past 6 years, I've ended up working as information designer in many different contexts with people that are trying to find different answers. So for example, with the Global Health Unit at the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, and one of the challenges was, how can we disseminate health information for evidence-based decision-making? Or again, with the Global Health Unit team, how can we teach school children to assess the reliability of the health claims? And we ended up now collaborating on a project with Rwanda, Kenya, Uganda, Norway, and UK. And we are developing resources that allow teachers to teach kids how to become able to assess the reliability of health claims. This is Professor Morelli, leading global climate scientist. So for example, we did a trip to Greenland. The big question was not just how to communicate climate science, but how can we address climate change to activate collaborations across sectors. So in a way that is solution-based, is opportunity-based. So we are not looking just at the systemic crisis, but we are looking at the opportunities. At the moment, I'm working on a project with the Milieu Directorate, and the challenge is how can we visualize the state of the environment in Norway through an engaging data story. And for example, we are trying to develop a different way of working together. So initially they called us and they say, we would like to run a workshop in the organization. And then we sat down and we said, okay, what are your challenges? And one of the challenges is try to communicate the environmental targets in Norway. And so we realized that maybe just running a workshop and then leave is not the best way for the people to become able to actually communicate their message in a powerful way. So we said, why don't we co-design? So you have the challenge, we work together, and instead of just running a workshop in a general way, we will be leading the design and we will guide you through all the steps. So you will be going through the process and you will be going through all the different like nitty-gritty design tricks and tips and knowledge that you might need to create a final piece. And this is Professor Tony Allan, Stockholm Water Prize winner and inventor of virtual water. And this has been one of the longest collaborations that I've had. And the challenge is, how can we make water science understandable in engaging ways? And I would like to focus on that now a little bit, because that's where my heart and stomach lies. So when people ask me to describe this journey and this process, I usually show this picture, which is me at 4 a.m. during my MA thesis at Central St. Martin's, taken by a friend after one of my data analysis sessions spent on analyzing the water footprint research and the virtual water research. Now, this picture reminds me of the passion that just pushes us in sometimes very unexpected directions. But it also reminds me of my limits, and it reminds me that if we want to communicate complex information, and especially if you want to communicate science in an effective way, we have to collaborate with experts. We have to collaborate with the audiences. So all the stuff that I've experienced so far makes me realize that the most important thing is never think that design is a solo performance. That's why I think design is very, still in university, I think design and arts And I think it's something that now is becoming more and more distinct in a way, because design is becoming, or there is a stress on the process rather just on artifacts. And this process is highly collaborative. So why did I fall in love with this topic? Because at the end of my MA in information design, I came across this quote by Ismail Srajeddin, the former vice president of the World Bank. He said, if the wars of this century were fought over oil, the wars of the next century will be fought over water, unless, of course, we change our approach to manage this precious resource. Now, these words dragged me into the unknown reality of the water crisis, and I decided that I would spend 12 months of my MA project just to understand why, the reasons of these statements, and try to do something about it. So I did not have a specific goal when I started working and researching on the United Nations World Water Development Report, and I didn't have a story to tell. What I remember is that this was the most official report in relation to the water crisis, and it has been incredibly difficult to go through the 500 pages report, very dense, of very detailed information about the state of freshwater resources, the challenges of governance, the ecosystem. And when I read the word shared responsibility, I thought there is a very little sharing potentially here if we don't communicate the information in a clear way. But thanks to this report, I discovered something that I had no idea of, because I came across the virtual water research by Professor Tony Allen. And I realized that I knew nothing about the way we use water. So the gist is that we think that the water we use is the water that runs through our hands, is the water that we use for drinking, washing, cleaning. And this in technical terms is called the domestic consumption, right? And according to the Water Footprint Network, it accounts to 137 liters of water every day on average per capita, so for me and for each one of us. But there is a problem though, because what we consume at home is visible to us, but it's only a little bit of the scenario, of the reality, because there are two invisible parts. So the first invisible part is the water we use to produce the industrial products we consume every day, such as paper, cotton, clothes. And that amounts to 167 liters per capita per day, according to the Water Footprint Network. But the big elephant in the room is the second invisible part, which is the water that is associated with the production of the food we consume every day. And that amounts to 3,496 liters per capita per day, on average, for each one of us. So, 92% of the water that we use on global average per capita is due to food production. So it's due to the food we eat, to the food we waste, to the food we consume, okay? So this makes you think that when we talk about the water crisis, we have to start thinking about our farmers, because those are the real water stewards on Earth. But the big problem was that after going through the United Nations World Water Development Report and understanding that actually the world is thirsty because it is hungry, I also realized that I had been bombarded with campaigns on water telling me to stop letting water run for hours while having a shower or while brushing my teeth, which is extremely important. But then I realized that if we want to do something about the water crisis, we have to start thinking about what we eat and how we produce what we eat. So for years, I've been witnessing millions of dollars spent on campaigns that were communicating actually the wrong problem and the wrong solutions. And you just wonder, why on earth is this possible? So I decided to spend 12 months on the research, and at that time, 6-7 years ago, I was doing everything manually, and I just ended up creating maps, interactive maps, a 900 pages book that became the Encyclopedia on the Water Footprint, where I redesigned the whole water footprint research through diagrams and words and drawings to make it more accessible and more engaging, and models, 3D models, and every possible thing. And one of the results of the project was I started giving talks. And that was very interesting. So I was standing on stage most of the time as a designer, not talking about design, but talking about water through design. And that happened again and again. I was exploring verbal communication, the use of videos, for example, the use of diagrams outside of a screen. So what's the effect on an audience when you start bringing diagrams on stage, for example? What's the effect of video? What's the effect of you there talking rather than just images, for instance? I got invited on national TV, and the invitation sounded like, as long as you use your images, you can talk about anything you want. And I went there talking about virtual water on national TV, and in a country like Italy, you realize how powerful TV still is if you want to reach a million in 10 minutes. And they had no idea, maybe, of my agenda, positively, but they just let me do whatever I wanted. So I started writing articles about it, bridging between major water scientists, and sometimes I got caught in major discussions. So you have like these leading water scientists, and you think, I'm pretty sure that they talk to each other, right? I mean, I've been collaborating with them for 7 years, but we spent 3 weeks to agree on 2 numbers in this article, So 3 weeks, and it became just like almost a nightmare. And one of the leading scientists told me, "Dear Angela, I'm sorry you have had such a drama with your piece. On reflection and after this struggle to find categories that satisfy the needs of the person in the streets as well as a critical scientist, I sense that my good intent, namely to emphasize water for food production, worries critical scientists. So they prioritize the quality of categories and tidy statistics, which are the outcome of agreeing to look no further, against whether knowledge can be effectively conveyed and behavior changed." So what I've learned through this process, one of the many things that I've learned, is that data is always a degree of uncertainty. But humans don't like uncertainty. So the result is that we either tend to hide uncertainty, and that can be misleading, or we have to just cooperate to become better and better at communicating uncertainty. Because data are uncertain, so data is not gold, but data are extremely important. It's the only thing that we can have, actually, to provide evidence or to convince people to shift a behavior or to support policy-making decisions, for example. I turned this information into a big installation piece for Slow Food International. 15,000 farmers coming all over the world at this event. It's called Terra Madre. And this piece was 15 meters long by 3 meters. And it visualized that actually vegetables are very low water intensive in comparison to meat, for example. So this kind of like was a tool to spark a conversation. And then at one point I started getting frustrated. I started thinking, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I want to just shift towards a digital piece that allows people to understand the gist and understand the message, but in a different way. So I came across this piece, slaveryfootprint.org, 5 years ago, and this was the first parallax. Now we are very used to the scrolling. But at that time, we had very little width, and I think almost no infographic done in that way. So when I came across this piece, I was just thinking, wow, this is a very interesting approach to build a narrative. So one of the things that we do in our courses, we we discuss and we teach people how to build the data stories. So we try to back what we say through some research that has been done on how to actually construct a visual story. And you will discover that there is a lot of resources, there is a lot of literature, and you can actually play narrative visualizations along the continuum of reader-driven and author-driven approach. Okay, in a reader-driven approach, ideally you let the reader explore the information without any pre-organized pattern or predetermined, I would say, path. In an author-driven approach, you have a very strict linear path. Think about an animation or think about a video. So when I went through this slavery footprint of our piece, I thought, wow, this is very nice, because they are forcing me into reading the information in a linear way, but there is the scrolling down that you can play with a lot to insert the bit of sense of wonder or magic that can keep, if used wisely, that can keep the attention very high. So I started writing a draft of my story, and actually this was a very time-consuming process. At that time, I had already had on my shoulders 4 or 5 years of talking about this. So I had very clear in mind my message and the peak of my story. But yet, sitting down and writing about science to lay people as a non-designer, as a designer and non-scientist, was extremely complex. I had a supervisor. He was a senior editor that works on water science books. I had a design advisor. At one point, while I was writing, I was also start constructing the visual narrative in my head. So this is one of the things that I share most of the time. So when you are writing for a piece that is a visual piece, you are not just writing for reading, you are writing for seeing. And that's very different. So you, at the same time, while you are writing, you are conceiving almost images in your head, and you start sketching them down. The important thing is that words and images have to work in sync. So many people, I mean, the quote that a picture is worth 1,000 words is very nice, but to me, a picture can be worth a lot of confusion. And most of the people, one of the reasons why, most of the time, also, why people get very confused when you have like the scrolling is because imagery take, I would say, overwhelms almost the words, and people lose track. So images are extremely important, and they are dangerous at the same time. And when people, when discuss why is that, I mean, why is that there is this buzz around data visualization? Why is that people want to learn how to visualize information? I mean, there is almost like a biological reason behind this, and this is very interesting because Tor Noretranders is a physicist, and he shows us that the human visual system is an enormously powerful pattern detector, and he tried to convert the bandwidth of our senses into computer terms to help us understand the extraordinary capability of our visual system in comparison of the other to the other senses. So here the blue area is the amount of information that we perceive per second through sight, and the pink is touch, and the yellow is hearing and smell, and the taste is magenta. So we process information through all our senses, but the visual system is by far the fastest and most active. I mean, one could say, wow, that's amazing, and it sounds all positive, but it's not all positive to me, because you can tip off very easily to the positive side or the negative side. You can communicate or you can mislead. So that's why it's extremely important to be very conscious anything you do visually. So while I was in the process of writing and putting together my visual story, I started crafting the actual visuals, so in a more and more refined way. And then at one point we had to add the HTML and parallax and all the scrolling, and I had to interact with a team of developers. So the communication, so when you are like on a level of sketching, if you're doing this for a client, for example, or let's say now the work that we're doing with the environment agency, or if you have to interact with developers, you always need artifacts like what I would call more like an exploratory way of communicating what you're doing. And that's extremely important, because you need to give people extremely precise instructions. Okay? So just to give you an idea, this is a screenshot of how the final visualization looks like in a static way. And most of the time when we do exercises on how to build a visual narrative, people find extremely hard to condense the main message in one sentence. And people find really hard to decide where to put the peak of the story. So I knew that from the very beginning. So the peak of my story is here, and it is what I showed you, is the 92%. So Mandy McAdams is a journalist, is a journalism teacher, and she says that the story is not a flat line. It resembles a mountain. So you need to drag people up to the peak. You need to give them something that made the journey worthwhile, but then you don't kick them off the peak, right? You have to walk them down, and sometimes this journey of walking them down is probably the most important thing, because I would say that in a story, the peak is very important and the end is very important. So that's the most memorable thing. In this specific case, we gave at the very end 3 tips of 3 things that you can do. Okay? And one of the tools that sometimes we use is that ask people to write a story by starting from the end and see how it works. That's a very good exercise. So what happens? This is 0 funding project, 9 months of desperate night and day, and then I was exhausted when I launched. I thought, I will never do anything about water anymore. I don't want to see this anymore. And then I launched it, and it's picked by all the major media in several countries. And the result, like the feedback, was overwhelming. I would never expected that. So what happens is that actually the ripples I'm dealing with the ripples today. So I am now in touch with people to create a multi-language platform. So translating the infographic in different languages and create a teaching package for kids, so that teachers can teach on the World Water Day. So potentially launched next year. So my promise of not dealing with water anymore was false. So I'm going to read you some of the emails because I started receiving hundreds of emails. And I thought that it's interesting to share the emails because you understand how something like that can have ripples in many different fields or in many different directions. So dear Angela, I'm an English teacher in a French school where I teach to teenagers and young adults. And I've been showing your project Water Wheat in my classes with very much pleasure recently. It has aroused tremendous interest from my students, and I would like to be able to renew this fantastic teaching experience next school year with other classes. As it is sometimes a bit tricky to connect to internet in my classes, I would like to ask you if you would mind to give me a copy, a static copy, basically on the piece. So hoping I will be able to spread your message among my students next year, I thank you in advance. So this is a teacher from France. I got in touch with her, and that's where the idea of creating a teaching resource for kids started. Dear Angela, I thank you again for your convincing presentation about everyday use of water. I've been thinking about becoming a vegetarian, although including fish. for several years because I thought it might be good for the environment. But as with everything else, I wanted it not to be a mere assumption, but evidence-based. This is a scientist. After going through your water presentation, I thought I had seen it black and white. It will mean a difference to the environment if I, and hopefully others will follow, quit needing it. I already knew from a public health perspective that guidelines advise as little meat, and especially red meat, in the diet as possible. Your presentation put the necessary load on the way to change habits with that every day, very day. So that was a scientist. Dear Angela, I'm writing this letter to convey my appreciation for the work you have done to educate people on hidden water. I'm from India. During the recently concluded Environment Conference COP in Paris, one of our politicians, a minister responsible for environment, had come up with suggestions based on the Indian lifestyle being environmental friendly. The statement that our minister had made was partially right, but mostly wrong. I also used water data to fact check and your work to understand. At times, many of our politicians worldwide are happy with temporary fixes that unfortunately could do loads of harm in the long run. Please continue the good work you are doing, hoping to see your similar contribution on other issues affecting humanity. So this was a politician from India. And this is my favorite one. Yeah. Okay. Dear Angela, congratulations to your wonderful infographic, The Water We Eat. It all makes good sense to a young sustainability practitioner like me, but only in the case I assume I was American. In fact, I am German. Now I live in Argentina, and I've recently worked in Barbados, 15th most water-scarce country in the world, and Jordan, 4th most water-scarce country in the world. Having passed this infographic onto a colleague of mine in Amman, I'm not quite sure she can identify with we, so I use we in the infographic. Neither can I, and neither good friends of mine in Barbados, Singapore, Morocco, or South Africa. We waste too much water for sure. Probably Jordan could be a good way of showing how you can live with using 150 cubic meters a year in average. Kind regards, Benedict. So, just a second. Okay. So Benedict was right because he was pointing at the fact that I was using averages. Okay? So, but this decision was very conscious. So this is the global average water footprint per capita, as I explained you like very quickly in the beginning. So let's see what happens when we compare the global average to the values of each country. So this is USA. This is Republic Democratic of Congo. This is Brazil. This is China, India, Russia, South Africa, Italy, France, Uganda, Norway. So it is true that each country has different numbers, but my goal was to show that although the numbers are different, the same pattern repeats again and again. So I have learned that it's extremely crucial to think carefully why you're showing what you're showing, because people will get back at you either in a friendly way or in a nasty one. So you better be prepared to answer. So I had a very nice exchange with Benedict because I was waiting for this email and I was looking forward to it. So, and I actually included in my teaching because using averages and the way you organize your data is extremely important because you can actually highlight very different messages, right? In a later project on food waste, it was actually this email that pushed me into visualizing the data not in a global average, but considering different regions of the world. because in that case, there are dramatic differences. Now, it is extremely important, that's the gist, to understand what type of story you are telling. And it is extremely important to remember that each data set can hide many different stories. And you can actually say a different story according to the context, according to the message you want to communicate, according to your goal and what you want to achieve. For example, how many stories hide behind this number, 50,400 liters, which is the amount of liters that you need to produce 1 kilo of beef. So if you go through the infographic later on, you will understand better what I'm talking about. So how many stories hide behind this number? Story number one, the 15,400 liters can have a different impact according to the way the meat is produced. So if the cow is raised in an industrial system, the cow eats grains, and the grains have been produced through irrigation, meaning water that has been pumped from underground water resources that required hundreds of years to be replenished. If the cow is raised on grass, it eats grass, namely water that is already in the soil. So meat raised on grass is more water sustainable than meat produced in industrial systems. Story number two, 15,400 is an average. In fact, 1 kilo of meat produced in USA requires 27,125 liters, 6,400 in the Netherlands, 16,400 in India, and 19,400 in Brazil. And that's the global average, the one in red. Story number three. On average, producing meat takes loads of water, wherever it is produced. So producing meat takes anyway much water than producing vegetables. Story number four. The average daily water consumption. Oh, I lost the average daily water consumption of a meat-eating person is much higher than the average of a vegetarian. So in countries where there are, for example, 5,000 liters per day, if you are a meat eater, 2,500 liters per day on average if you are a vegetarian. So in countries where there is a culture of heavy meat consumption, even just one day, one free meat day a week, is a good decision, and it's a doable thing. So the gist is that there are many potential data stories that hide in your data set. So identifying the right one depends on your goal, depends on the context, depends on the people receiving the message, and depends on what you are trying to do. Are you trying to raise awareness? Are you trying to raise understanding? Are you trying to move people to action? Now, during the past 7 years, I've basically learned that, especially from a designer point of view, an image can actually very often trap a message in a visualization that looks perfect and without uncertainty and beautiful and neat and clear. But reality is not like that. Reality is very complex. And in the same way, science is very complex. So sometimes we need complex tools to visualize complexity. And the point is that how can we become better at visualizing complexity in a clear way so people understand uncertainty as well? So I usually say that I have like 3 major points that I like repeating, that it's all about the process, from data to action. It's important to facilitate the process with different stakeholders, that cognition is in the detail. So as a designer, I truly believe in the importance of looking at the little corner and looking at the color and all the design aspect when you are crafting a presentation. And I think that beauty will save the world. And there is a lot of research that shows that beauty makes what we do memorable. You can misuse beauty, because memorability can be created on things that are not probably worth paying attention, but you can also use it for the good. So just to leave you with the last thought, this is how I feel most of the time at the very beginning of my journeys. I feel lost in a labyrinth. So that's me. And collaborating and co-designing with both scientists and experts and with the audience, you slowly change perspective and you start seeing things from above. And from above you can actually see things that you would be completely oblivious to from the ground. And of course from above, once you get up in the air, you can see the patterns and you can spot the right solution and the right narrative. So it is a collaborative process, it's not a solo performance. Yeah, that was me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, just in time. We have some time for questions, or just discussion, or just chatting.
Any questions?
Do you typically have big customers that you work with? Do you do smaller
I have
pieces
worked with research organizations. I've been approached by big customers such as tobacco companies, so I rejected the offer for conflict of interest. But yeah, I mean, I work mainly with we work mainly, and we are targeting a lot of research organizations, but also, like I would say, governments and any NGOs. So it depends on. I would say that research organizations and NGOs and yeah, small organizations have been at least so far. But I believe that also the potential of what we do is very big in connection to like in large projects, for example. So I don't see the applicability of this is not just within a project where you, let's say, you have to just visualize a data set. It can be in a large context where visualizing or communicating something complex is just one part of the project. So you can collaborate with other agencies, with other companies, within a larger, long-term project.
And do you also work with the distribution of the infographics, or is it only the design of it?
Not really. I mean, that really changes. That really changes. Specifically for this, of course, it was my own interest to reach as many as possible. So you get in touch with the major media, but of course there is always even if you are not responsible directly for the dissemination, that's always a major part of the discussion with the client. Like, for example, the project we're doing with the environmental agency is almost automatic, because communicating without reaching out is almost pointless. So, of course, we are brainstorming a lot also on how can we make the message spread as much as possible. So they might be in charge in getting in touch with the right people or with the right place, but of course it's part of the co-design experience, I would say. Yeah, and it depends, because for example in the work that we do with the Norwegian Institute for Public Health, these are like major scientific projects. So we are just like a little tiny bit. So we deal more like with the design of the complex information part, but there is like a huge machinery around it, like in a positive sense. If you think about involving 100 schools in Uganda and doing randomized trials, researchers writing papers and articles about it, it's a huge team where, of course, we are not leading. We are a piece of the puzzle. Yeah, so it really depends.
Anyone else?
Everyone thought it was
Always Claire.
It's very good.
I thought it was really interesting and when you're talking about how to turn information into knowledge, which is like a huge potential for all of us really, and especially within like communicating science, but also in the other things that we do.
Yeah,
So,
definitely. And I think I'm going, since I was collaborating with the Guts to Change project. It's a project that we have been working for the refugee crisis. So, so we are so the leading the initiators of the project are both the people in business, service designers, and innovators and researchers. And there is actually a very interesting conversation that's going on at the moment. So what is design? Because design, you tend to think that design, I mean, mainstream, if I go out and I say tell someone that I am a designer, people refer to images and aesthetics and products. But design is changing. It's changing extremely fast because it's about finding solutions to big challenges. And in order to do that, of course, you have to deal with a much more. I would say that you focus not just on the artifacts and the outcomes, but you focus a lot on designing, for example, conversations and dialogue. How do you facilitate the dialogue between different stakeholders? I mean, that's a new tentacle, I would say, of design. So I think that all these new ways of working and collaborating with different stakeholders can offer a very good space. If you think about along that process from data to change, you have many potential collaborations and many different discussions that you, as a designer, you have to construct and facilitate. But that's design as well. So it's not just about the poster and book and the typography. So, and I think it is important to make people understand this potential, especially when it comes to business and innovation. Yeah, so it's very interesting.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Is it about who or?
Okay.